Well, Dr. Irena Scott received a PhD from the University of Missouri in physiology. She did postdoctoral research at Cornell, has been an assistant professor at St. Bonaventure University, has done research and teaching at the Ohio State University and the University of Missouri and also Nevada, and at Patel Memorial Institute. Her publications include books, works in scientific journals, magazines, newspapers, and a correspondent for Popular Mechanics magazine. And she served on the MUFON board of directors from '93 until 2000. She's also a MUFON consultant in physiology and astronomy and a field investigator, and she joined us. Welcome, Dr. Scott.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we're going to talk about your research into the UFO phenomenon. So when did you start your research?
I started in the 1990s. I started researching some things that happened and then joined a local group and then later joined MUFON and CUFOS, which was active then.
Yeah. Why did you start researching this topic?
Oh, there were several reasons. One is that my sister and I had sightings since we were small children. We didn't know what they were then. Mm-hmm. And then we had some later. And so I'd been interested for quite a while, but I didn't actively talk about it or come out of the closet until about the 1990s.
Okay, well, we'll talk about one of those sightings in particular in just a moment, but I just wanted to ask you, what sets you apart as a researcher on the UFO phenomenon and the issue of cover-ups as opposed to other researchers?
I had worked for several government agencies. I'd worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for several years in satellite photography, which included airplane identification. I had also worked at Battelle Memorial Institute, which did some studies for Project Blue Book, and I knew a number of people that also worked there. And I had also been at Wright-Patterson. I'd been stationed there for work off several times, and then also knew people there that showed me around.
So you were basically right there, and some of the places you've worked at, you've mentioned right in the thick of things.
Of what?
You're basically right in the middle of. I mean, you talk about Wright Air Force Base. I mean, of course, synonymous with Roswell.
Yes, I had been there, and I knew the archivist, and he had showed me around and even invited another person and I to what's called the Blue Room, the secret Blue Room, and we attended a meeting about UFOs.
Is your research solely aimed at proving that UFOs are real, or does it go deeper?
I think I'm just mainly talking about what I found out from my own experience and from doing research. I don't think you can prove UFOs are real. I think they have to do that themselves in a way.
Right. So as far as UFOs are concerned, so has there been a cover-up according to your research?
Yes, I think there has. In my research, I thought right from the beginning, from like Kenneth Arnold, and obviously, which happened at the same time, Roswell, it seemed like there was a cover-up that like they might have known something about UFOs even before that.
Well, that of Kenneth Arnold, of course, is the gentleman who spotted a number of UFOs, and it was pre-Roswell. So the cover-up seems to go, I guess, well before Roswell. Do you think it started well before then?
Well, we interviewed these two women that were daughters of a Reverend Holt, who was a cousin of Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State. He was going to run as vice president for Roosevelt, and he didn't. But he was a high person in the government, very high. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And we interviewed these two daughters that said they weren't supposed to say anything about this until their father and his cousin Cordell Hall were dead. But they said that Cordell Hall showed them a room that was under the Capitol that had sort of a crashed vehicle and bodies, and he called them creatures. They weren't called aliens then, that were preserved, I think, in formaldehyde or something. And they thought this was about 1939.
Wow.
Quite a bit before Arnold. And that was the first evidence we had of the government, that the government might have known something way back then and been covering it up ever since.
Yeah. Do you think it's a coincidence with the Roswell crash that the crash actually happened in Roswell, where obviously there was a number of qualified people that work in that area that are able to identify a UFO?
I thought so, because that was the 509th Division, and they were the people that dropped the atomic bomb. They were about as knowledgeable as anybody you could find. And so it was quite interesting that they thought it was a UFO crash and then changed their story.
Yeah.
Because the people should have known.
Yeah, it's always amazed me that with the technology that the ETs have, and the fact that they can crash their craft. I mean, does your research indicate that there's a little bit more to it than just them crashing their craft? Perhaps, do you think they may have been brought down?
I don't know. Another person, Gene Sider, a Frenchman, and I wrote a couple of articles about that. Maybe it wasn't a real crash. Maybe it was something that the aliens had made to look like a crash. That it was kind of an important place in history because it was, well, as you said, the top technology, but also it was about the start of the Cold War too.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things going on right then.
Can you give us an example of a typical cover-up process?
Well, I can think of one. Well, Roswell, of course, because of the people thought it was a UFO and then changed their mind. There's been a lot of them, such as Project Blue Book, where they claim they didn't find anything. Big things such as the Robertson panel and the Kahneman report, where they both said that they didn't find anything. And in one of my books, Sacred Quarters, I went into quite a bit of detail about Battelle and their research on UFOs. They were doing they're top scientists. Battelle's a really well-known scientific organization. It was one of the developers of Xerox and things, and CDs and other things, and in charge of a number of labs. So they were real good scientists. And they did a study of UFOs. And before they finished, the CIA had the Robertson panel, and the Battelle had asked them in a letter that was later leaked to not do the study yet because they didn't have the information. And the CIA went right ahead with the study and then claimed there was nothing to UFOs, which...
Right. I mean, does your intel indicate why why the cover up, why they need to keep it quiet?
Well, I think to start with, it started out when UFOs first started out, they didn't know whether it was military or something from another country. And I think they wanted to keep that information secret. And they also wanted to keep it secret if they had new advances and things and were discovering new developments that they could find from UFOs. But so I think there was reasons why they started it, because it was just considered a military thing. But after all these years, you don't know.
Right. I mean, can you say whether, you know, the people that you talk with or work with, I mean, has anything been said to you, you know, I guess in secret, but I'm not sure whether you can tell us right here and now.
The thing that I talked about in some of my books was when I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm sorry, my supervisors had reported we were supposed to use photography and identify all the airplanes under a particular location. And my supervisors reported a UFO to their supervisors. And these were, I think my top supervisor might be a GS-14 or something, pretty high ranking. And it was on 2 photographs, so we could see it in stereo if we adjusted things. And so it was definitely something that was there. Well, their supervisors acted very strangely and kept insisting that it was a spot on the film. And it obviously wasn't, because anybody knew anything about their job would know that it was something real. And they even had it tested by a specialist to make sure it wasn't a spot on the film. And it obviously wasn't, because it was on 2 different pictures. And so they were really surprised and mystified about why their supervisors were telling them it didn't exist when it was right there.
Yeah. Your investigation came across the possibility that there was material from a UFO that may have been tested at one of the research institutes. I think it was Battelle.
Yes. What was odd about the study that they did for Project Blue Book, the study was supposed to be a statistical study of the observations that were reported for Project Blue Book. And so it involved statisticians, and it involved people that developed a questionnaire that used discrete data that you could put in a computer for UFO observations. And what was very mysterious about that was that Battelle hired metallurgists. Mm-hmm. Was way off the what they needed to do the study. And then later, I mean, Battelle, people wondered about that because it just didn't make sense. But many years later, we found out this man that was a metallurgist had told informally, he didn't go publish it because he had got fired, but yeah. He told a friend that he had worked on UFO material. And he's dead now, and so we couldn't recontact him. But we had it from the person that he told it to, that, you know, so it's firsthand that he said that he was working on UFO material.
So material not of this world? I mean, he was pretty definite about that?
Yes. His name was John Center, and he was a metallurgist, and he had a good reputation. He'd had a lot of publications and things, and developed methods to study metals. And he said that just that he was studying material from a crash in New Mexico. And what was odd about that was he talked about it to the person about 1952, and nobody in 1952 had heard of Roswell. Roswell in the news until about 1980 when they wrote books about it. So the general public didn't know anything about it. And
right.
Talking about that way back then.
Well, we talk about smoking gun evidence. I mean, other than something like that, is there any smoking guns that you uncovered during your research about cover-ups?
Well, there were quite a few. I mean, for example, I could just start with Kenneth Arnold. When he first reported to the Wright-Patterson that he had seen these objects, he had pretty good account, and he was a good pilot and qualified and everything. And they totally ignored him. And this is something that they should have paid attention to. If there's things flying around that are that far beyond our capabilities. They were a lot faster than we had airplanes in. He had a good observation. And there were also a number of other observations coming in from the same place. Airline pilots and other people had seen the same thing.
I understand the Kenneth Arnold sighting wasn't just the sighting, it was quite a bit afterwards, and where sources close to Kenneth, or Kenneth himself, may have thought that he was being followed or being watched for quite a time.
Yes, he had two government people had contacted him, and they seemed very interested in UFOs at the time. And so he was going to, flying to a place in Washington, the state of Washington, to let me see, I forget why, but he didn't tell anybody he was going, and he landed, and he couldn't find a motel or hotel or anything to stay in. And he called around and called the most expensive hotel in town, and they said there was a reservation for him. And he never made a reservation. Nobody knew he was coming.
Mm-hmm.
He thought somebody else had by that name, had the reservation. And so he went anyway, and it turned out nobody else did. So it sounded fishy to start with. There was a reservation in his name when nobody knew he was coming. And then he was interviewing these people that said these Harbor Patrol people that said they had seen a UFO, and part of that was a hoax, but it was a very elaborate hoax because there were a lot of people involved in it, that a lot more people than just two Harbor Patrolmen, because when he got there and contacted them, the first thing one of them said was, "Stay away from this, don't have anything to do with it," which wasn't what a hoaxer would normally say. And so when he talked to the people, there were verbatim reports of what was going on in his room and what they were talking about that went to a newspaper. And he didn't understand that at all. And also another airplane pilot had seen what looked like the same UFOs as him, and they were both in the room together with these two Harbor Patrolmen. And the newspaper was getting reports on what they said in their room. And at that time, what they thought of bugs were big things that were plugged in and things.
Yeah, yeah.
So it sounded like somebody had a very miniature bug in their room someplace. They suspected the bug, but they couldn't find it, and it sounded like it was pretty sophisticated.
Well, this next question may tie in with this a bit, because in your book, UFOs Today, 70 Years of Lies, Misinformation and Government Cover-Up, you talk about mind control being used in the cover-up process. Is that true? Can you explain that?
Well, I thought just to start with Kenneth Arnold, something that very unusual happened to him, which was kind of like an abduction or something. He was to interview this man that claimed to have seen the UFO, and he went to the man's secretary's house, and he said it looked like a normal house. His secretary was there at the table sorting through papers, and he interviewed the person, and it just looked like a normal house. And so the next day he went back and found the house, and he said it looked like nobody had ever been there. That it was covered with cobwebs, and the door was covered with cobwebs, and he couldn't imagine that anybody even been there. And it sounded so strange, just like an abduction tale sounds today.
That is very strange indeed. A lot's been written about and reported on Roswell. Did your investigations reveal anything new?
We found another possible witness, and we just put it out to public domain to see if we'd find any other information on it. We had a tape recording of this man that said he might have seen the Roswell crash. He was a deputy sheriff, and he and the sheriff went from Big Springs, Texas to Roswell. And on their way, they were to pick up a prisoner. On their way, they heard a radio broadcast that there'd been a crash. And they didn't say the Roswell crash because nobody knew anything about it back then. And so they knew their way around in that area and found the roads and things and figured out where it was and went to see it. And he said there was a round circular object. It was about 100 feet in diameter. And there were bodies. And that these were being lifted by a lift onto a truck. And he said they were covered up, but the wind blew some covering off, and they looked like a kind of brownish and small and Google-eyed. And then the soldiers told him to leave, and so they did. And so he had wondered if that might have been a Roswell crash.
Yeah. So let's talk about your UFO encounters. How many have you had?
Several, probably 5 or 6 with other witnesses.
Right. Well, the one I wanted to talk about is the one that almost cost you your life.
Yeah.
So can you take us through what happened?
It was with my sister, and I was working in Washington, D.C. For the DIA, and my sister was attending Drew University for postgraduate work. And so we were both on the east side of the country, and we decided to go up and see the East Coast and New England states, have a vacation. And so I drove from Washington, D.C. to New Jersey, which is practically in New York, and picked her up. And we headed toward Boston, where we were planning to stay all night. And we got there early. And so we decided to just look around some before we did anything else. And so we drove up on Route 3 into New Hampshire. And after we thought it was getting dark, we turned around and came back. It turned out that we actually drove through part of the area where the Betty and Barney Hill sighting had been, which is sort of interesting. That's
the Bridgewater Triangle area?
I found that out just recently, that was a bridge. I didn't know anything about it until this year when somebody told me. But we came back, and we were just on vacation. The last thing our minds were UFOs. And so we came back and drove into Boston, and we couldn't find a motel. Everything was full, and so we decided to look around the outer belt. And so we were leaving Boston, and as we left, we kept seeing this thing south of us that looked like it was kind of following the freeway. It was just a light, and it was blinking, but there was an airport also around there, the Norwood Memorial Airport, and we could see airplanes coming in from the east and turning on their landing lights and landing, and we could see regular airplanes. Well, this was lower than the airplanes. And the airplanes, of course, had red and green lights and everything. And this was just one white light that was blinking. And my sister kept saying, "This is weird." And then she started saying, might be a UFO. And I thought she just flipped. I was busy looking for the motel. And so we drove around and argued about it. And it was pretty evident, and we both, noticed it, but I thought, well, it couldn't be a UFO, and I told her it was a helicopter blinking its landing lights, even though I'd never seen anything like that. And we argued, and we weren't finding a motel, and so I continued driving and got on Route 95, which is a main east, north-south route on the East Coast. And we continued to argue. And I was driving along, there was a woods. And in the woods, there was a round object. It looked like a sphere. It seemed to have a light inside of it. It was going through a spectrum of like all the shades of red and all the shades of blue. And I just couldn't figure out what on earth that was. And then the inside of our car lit up in green. And I was just totally mystified on what on earth is going on. And I looked at the object because I thought it must be shining a light. But I couldn't see a green anywhere except inside our car. And this was 1968, which was basically before lasers, so I didn't think of laser or anything like that back then. And so, I was just totally confused, but I kept on driving and we kept right on arguing. And so after a while, my sister started screaming at me. It was going to go right over the car. And so I pointed at it and I was going to say, "See, dingbat, it's a helicopter," where I thought it was going to appear. And then I saw a meteor way off, and then this thing came over the road. And I realized my sister was right and I was wrong. She said that right when we first saw it, that it shone a light in the car, and it was sort of like a bluish light. But I didn't see that, but I was looking out the window, so I probably didn't see it. And anyway, it was this big thing, and it had 7 square windows, and they were blinking in a particular pattern, like the first 3 would blink, all 7 would blink, and the last 4 would blink. And it was just this pattern the whole time. And so I had been taking pictures with a sort of box camera, but I also had a Polaroid with high-speed film in it. For back then, it was 3000 ASA film, which wasn't loaded in my camera. And so the thing was just real close, and we could really see the windows, and it had 2 little lights on either side, like a red light and a green light that weren't blinking, but they were real dim. And so I found my camera in the dark and my film in the dark and was loading the film. And it was just a wonderful picture. I mean, I thought, I could prove UFOs exist with that thing. And a truck driver drove in front of us and stopped. And just when I had my camera loaded and he was right in front of us, well, this truck driver started talking to me. He was standing right beside me. And he said, "What are you looking at?" And I couldn't understand what he meant, because there was this thing right up there in front of us. Yep. And so I pointed, and he turned around in the opposite direction and said, "I don't see anything." And then he just rotated around toward me and looked at me again. He was standing right beside me, and I was scared to take the picture with him there. And then he asked me again, "What are you looking at?" And I pointed again. And then he rotated around and said, "I don't see anything." He pointed his head just in exactly the opposite direction of where we were looking. And
didn't your sister confirm what you were seeing?
She remembered the truck driver, and she remembered he didn't see it, but she didn't seem to remember talking to him. And I don't understand that either. But wow. She was paying a whole lot of attention to the object, and she might have just not paid attention, because I remember she said she remembered he didn't see it, but she didn't know why she knew he didn't see it. And then he went back to his truck and just watched us. And I climbed a hill, because it was on a freeway, and I was afraid I'd get high-speed film, and I was afraid I'd get lens reflections or something. I climbed a hill, and the hill was bald. And I took pictures, and they turned out pretty weird. But anyway, then I came back down, and the thing was circling an airport. The airport we'd been watching, it was doing this real strange circle where it would go so fast you couldn't see it, and then it'd blink twice, and then blink its lights on and go so fast you couldn't see it. It just kept circling that way. And we saw the planes, and they were up above it, and we both were commenting on, the planes aren't landing now. They're up above it. They must be watching it or something. We definitely both saw that. And so, and I could hear noises, and it sounded like a jet or something, or maybe a sonic boom, but like, I thought maybe they're scrambling jets from the airport, but there weren't any jets, I found out later. And so anyway, I didn't know where the thing would go next. And my car was pointing south, and I decided to turn around at the next intersection and go north. And so I pulled out, And the truck driver just immediately pulled right in behind me, right on my bumper. And I couldn't figure out what he was doing, but I knew he was kind of crazy. And so anyway, I tried to get rid of him, and I changed lanes several times, and I speeded up and slowed down. And he just stayed right on my bumper. And he was beaming his lights in my mirror, and I was blinded. I couldn't see anything. And I was just driving down the freeway, and finally I just floored it and went as fast as the car would go, because I thought he's a trunky. He might take him a while to get up to speed, but it didn't. And he stayed right on my bumper. And so I thought he was going to kill us or something. I had no idea what was going to happen. And I finally decided what I'd do is go on the left-hand side of the road. And as soon as I saw another interchange, I would swerve off. And that was real dangerous, because somebody was coming up on the right-hand side.
Mm-hmm.
We would have, there had been an accident. And so anyway, and my sister couldn't see behind us either. But I don't think she knew how much danger we were in either. And so I did it and got rid of the truck driver.
Wow. But it didn't end there, did it? You had some strange things happen after that.
Yeah. We went back, and it stopped circling around the time we got back, and it started going northwest, and we followed it until we got on this real, beat up road that was like a trail with gravel and holes and everything, and houses a long ways apart. And we couldn't keep up with it. It was just a little bit faster than I could drive on that kind of a road. And so I turned around and went, and also that thing, the round thing that was changing color, it was still there when we went back north toward Boston, and the car lit up in green again. But when I came back the third time, we didn't see it. And then we went back to her dorm because we couldn't find a place. I think they were all closed. It must have been late. And we got back, and Bud Hopkins had asked if there was missing time. And I don't know. We didn't remember an abduction or anything like that, but there might have been missing time, because it seemed like we got back there a little bit later than we should have. And so anyway, then I went back to, we went to sleep, and I started back to Washington, D.C. When I got back there, I had a poltergeist experience too, which was totally weird.
Yeah. Was the truck driver, was he human?
I have no idea. Everybody asked me that. He looked perfectly normal. He didn't even have an accent to me. He was in Boston. Maybe he should have had a Boston accent. He just looked perfectly normal, but he sure didn't act normal.
Right. Now, what was your experience where you had a phone call and it was your voice on the other end of it? Was that tied in with this particular incident?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just thought that might have been part of, the deep secrets behind the scene, the boogeyman trying to warn you off and telling you, don't talk about this.
It was scary enough, but it wasn't part of that.
Wow. All right. So do you think the government and ETs have been working together in these cover-ups? Was anything to indicate that in your research?
A good friend of Dr. Hynek told me that she thought that maybe that Dr. Hynek thought that the government was in cahoots with ET. And that was just a theory of his. I don't think it's something he thought. I think he had a lot of theories, but that was one of them, because he wondered why the cover up, and he knew the government knew quite a bit about it that they weren't saying.
Right. Yeah, it's one of those mysteries, people are still trying to figure that out. But a couple more questions. Do you think the UFO phenomenon is just too complex to figure out?
Well, it probably is, because it appears they can do a lot of things that we can't do, including affect our minds. And for example, scientist Dr. Harley Rutledge did a real good study in Missouri in 1973 of UFOs, where they actually watched the UFOs while they set up field stations and watched the UFOs, and he thought they could, that they knew what people were doing and thinking.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a theory of how, if they eventually do, how ET will present itself to us? Do you think it'll be in a physical form?
It's hard to say because there's evidence they can affect your minds. And so it's hard to say. But I don't know. There's some evidence that they've been around here for a very long time. But it seems like now people have since 1947, people have the idea of it's from outer space or something, but it might be something a lot more complicated than extraterrestrials. It might be something that involves a quantum theory or something just
right
that we don't understand at all.
Yeah, it's one of those, when you try to understand it, you rack your brain, and in the end, you've just got to take 5 minutes and just chill out, because it really does bend your head, doesn't it, when you start to think about it?
And you wonder, with the quantum theory, you don't know really if space is real, space and time, because of some of the entangled particle experiments show that maybe space and time aren't even real. Maybe people have a very primitive understanding of reality in the universe too.
Well, you're a lot more smarter than I am, and if you can't figure it out, I guess that kind of makes me feel better. But Dr. Scott, one more question: do you have any thoughts on disclosure? And if it does happen, what will the world look like with disclosure?
Well, it looks like there's some of it going on now with, like the Times article from 2017, and the Nimitz and Princeton, the ships where they had UFOs on radar, and they had I think the Hornet aircraft go after them, and saw the Tic Tac object and all that. Mm-hmm. And then they're also showing some films that might show UFOs from the DIA. And so it looks like there's a tiny bit of disclosure going on now, which is good.
Yeah. I mean, I see it, I don't know if you'll agree, but it's like a relationship. It's like two people. If one person has been, I guess, unfaithful over a period of time and covering their tracks, and then eventually is found out and admits what they were doing, the reaction is normally an angry one from the other side. I mean, is that likely to happen with this? If suddenly they come out and say, yes, we've been lying to you all this time, I mean, I guess the reaction is not going to be a happy one.
I don't know, because the government has told lots of lies on other things, and people even believe them when they are out doing bald-faced lies and stuff. Who knows?
Yeah, no, it seems like they're pretty good at that.
Look, UFO just might get mad, but lots of people probably wouldn't pay attention to it either.
Right. Well, Dr. Scott, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. That was a really scary incident that you had back in 1968.
Yeah, I thought we were going to get killed. I mean, my sister.
Yeah, and I guess the words that immediately came into my mind were "Men in Black." I mean, that term's been made popular now, and we're speaking to someone about that in the next couple of hours. But thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Good luck with your future research, and I hope we can have a chat with you again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been very interesting talking to you.
Dr. Irena Scott talking to us today on the topic of government cover-ups.